it's about attitude. It is about mindset. This climate race, well, I was told by my publisher that the German title too should be Climate Race and not Klimawettlauf, is all about attitude. Wachstumsmentalität, wie es der Standard übersetzt hat. But at the end of the day, it is about how to do this can-do attitude, the can-do spirit, the win-wins of, yes, there are things we have to do. We do. This is the only climate science slide I will show you, and no surprise, it's hot today. Yes. This is more than that. This is today, July 27th, globally, pixel by pixel. It is not the temperature. It's not the excess temperature. It's how much of this excess temperature can be attributed to us emitting CO2 emissions. By the way, thanks to Friederike Otto, die letztes Jahr den Deutschen Umweltpreis gewonnen hat. So there's solid science behind this. We can now attribute today's and tomorrow's temperature to excess CO2. 5 years ago, it took Friederike 2 years, 18 months, to write the study that said, oh yeah, this particular hurricane, this particular temperature increase was due to CO2 emissions. Now we are doing this weather prediction style globally a day ahead. And it's this, it's the PDF. It's not the PDF Adobe gives us. It is the probability density function. It is the probability of certain temperatures occurring much, much, much more frequently because of global average warming. This science has been around forever too. IPCC 2007, not quite as old as CONVOCO, but close. This isn't about averages. This is not what's known, the mean, the median. Yes, that's bad enough. It is about the extremes. It's about the fact that, yes, of course, there's a trend, but it's the not knowing along the trend. That's what's costly. So when The Economist puts the next housing disaster on its cover and says by 2050, 9%, 10%, false precision, false accuracy, a tenth of global housing stock, potentially, possibly. Well, that's the mean, the median estimate. This is not the extreme scenario. So, yes, what's known is bad. What's not known, potentially much, much worse. Climate policy is insurance policy. Okay, that was not my brief today. It's this. See what I did there? And it's another Economist cover, 5 weeks ago. Typical Economist style. Sun, sand, and human imagination. And all three are limitless. Sun, sand, and human imagination. The best predictions we had. International Energy Agency, year after year after year, looks at the world and says, well, look at the German Energiewende began somewhere around here. Thank you for subsidizing the solar PV for the rest of us. But look, can't possibly work. The standard macroeconomy models tell us, yeah, if you subsidize, over-subsidize, you'll get a bit out of that, but that factory will move to China sooner rather than later. And it did. The German ones did. China, this year, added more solar PV just on rooftops alone, not the best place to put your solar panel. That is utilities, utility scale. solar. Just on rooftops. China, this year, than the rest of the world combined for all uses. All uses. China, this year overall, rooftop and utility, more than the rest of the world combined ever. That's a revolution. Sun, sand, and human imagination. 2060, not quite mid-century. 2060, which happens to be China's climate goal for net zero. Not as ambitious as the EU, not as ambitious as Germany, Austria. China has a net zero target in absolute terms. Saudi Arabia has a net zero target, 2070. Saudi Arabia has a net zero target. Why? 80, 85, 90%. Renewables, sun and wind in this case. Hydrogen, green hydrogen, 100% solar PV. This year, global total investment in electricity, full stop. Solar PV, more than everything else combined. Coal, gas, bit of oil, nuclear, wind, everything else combined. But haven't you thought about storage? Didn't you know that the sun doesn't shine at night? To which, as someone working on energy policy, the answer should be, that's what that is. Wow, that's why it gets dark at night. Thank you for telling me. Okay, here's California in April 2021, 3 years ago. There's a lot of sun when the sun shines. And we harvest that with solar PV. And then we keep the gas plants around because when everyone comes home at night at 7 p.m., turns on the air conditioning and the gas stove and everything else. Okay, gas stove, yes, that's gas. But if you turn on your electric stove, your induction stove, on the washing machine and so on, suddenly demand spikes. How do we do this? How did we did it? How did we do it in California 3 years ago? With gas. Hence the need for stable electricity. Yeah, there's a little bit of nuclear, and look how stable that is. There's some hydro. There's a bit of wind, which, by the way, blows when the sun doesn't shine as much, on average. April 24. 3 years. 3 years. Lithium-ion batteries. Half of the increase that was used to be needed to be met by gas is now lithium-ion batteries. This used to be called the duck curve, right? The duck bill sticking out. And oh my God, what do we do about this? I don't know what this is, a turtle or something, right? Looking out under its shell on the right here. And yes, this is a revolution in high-cost California. We talk about climate technology. Well, solar PV is a pretty dumb climate technology, but it is. 10 years ago, 2011, when the Energiewende started, it took massive subsidies to get anything going. It is the cheapest source of electricity in history. That comes with problems. Here's the world's largest solar manufacturer, LONGi. Chinese, of course. Laying off people this year, 5% of its workforce, because of overcapacity in solar production. What is LONGi's answer? $600 million investment in the largest manufacturing plant in the Western Hemisphere. Happens to be in a swing state in the US. Guess when the ribbon cutting ceremony will be? A month before the elections. Not a coincidence. I hope it works. Opposite would be catastrophic. You saw his clip last night when he said something along the lines of, fellow Christians, this is the last vote you need to come out for. You don't have to vote again in 4 years. Yeah, that's what we're up against. So there are bigger problems than even this. But even Trump can't stop this particular revolution. This will be yet another wall he fails to build. Can't stand in the way of something like a technology that, yes, is the cheapest source of electricity in history that causes problems. Why? Because it's too cheap. Right? There are 3 sources of money in the world. Literally, 3 total. It's shareholders, taxpayers, and households, the rest of us, ratepayers, consumers. And politics is about how to balance these 3. You can draw a straight line between sort of the traditional parties and each of these buckets. As one should. Of course, that's politics. Always has been, always will be. So here, okay, missing profits is a problem for shareholders, absolutely. It's also a problem for figuring out how to incentivize the investments in the first place. The $9 trillion necessary. That merits a German translation. 9 Billionen Dollar pro Jahr. Jedes Jahr. Für 30 Jahre. Okay, this is massive. And the German attitude could be, oh, wie bezahlen wir dafür? The English attitude, not the British one, they have their own problems, but the American English attitude would be, wow, how many unicorns fit into these $9 trillion? How do we do this? So here's a bit of history lesson, again, not as old as 2004 CONVOCO, this is 2009. The infamous McKinsey marginal abatement cost curve. How do you do this? Actually, why do we do this? Because, so us economists need this sort of input into our models. And the Nobel Prize winning solution is to start here at 0, put a finger in the air, and draw a line. And okay, McKinsey, bunch of 25-year-olds with too many frequent flyer miles and rings under their eyes, they actually sent them out to measure, to study, sector by sector, technology by technology. How do you do this? I used to work for BCG, so I get to make fun of the McKinsey guys. But this is incredibly useful. Why? Because it gives you sort of a roadmap, a static roadmap, but a roadmap nonetheless. Okay, look at the very leftmost sliver from 2009. Lighting. Switch incandescents to LEDs. Why would we do that? Because 90% of electricity in incandescent light bulbs goes to heat. 10% efficient. Amazing invention way back when. We still use the emoji when we talk about ideas and so on. Amazing, sure. But last century's technology. And yes, in raw climate terms, it pays for itself many times over. Okay, so this is where the free market comes in. Technologies exist. Companies figure out how to scale this because, look, there's money to be made. Convince, 8 billion of us to switch. Just start with the 330 million Americans and the 440 million or so Europeans. Massive market opportunity. You're being paid to abate emissions, to cut CO2 emissions. Now, nobody does that turns out. I never did it. At the time, I was moving from student apartment to student apartment year after year after year. So what do? Well, you pack your boxes, and then when it starts getting dark outside, when the solar panels no longer work, you sort of realize, oops, this is a broken light bulb. And I still have some unpacking to do. So you walk down to the corner store and you buy the first available light bulb. And by the way, you buy a 6-pack because, of course, these things are 25 cents. Who cares? Okay. 9 months later, when I get to move out again of my student apartment, I have 5 of these light bulbs left, which don't pack very well. They break. So I leave them for the next. Nobody's ever done this for me, by the way. Nobody ever left me a light bulb. But so I leave them for the next tenants. And I never look back. These things cost 25 cents. By the way, they didn't save me any money. I didn't pay for the electricity. The landlord does. Right? There are structural problems here, too. Okay, so what did it take? Well, it took the leftist, vaguely communist politician, fairly well-known politician, George W. Bush, to sign the light bulb, sorry, not the Light Bulb Freedom Act, that was the Freedom Party. So, the US also has their, Kickles and other people. But the Bush signed the Energy Independence Act of 2007 into law that set a standard that progressively within 15 years, by 2022, effectively banned incandescence. Okay, what happened? Well, Siemens, Philips, and General Electric got the marching orders, got the certainty of saying, go figure out how to make LEDs cheaper, better, more available. Give them the right look and feel and the sort of thing that consumers want to pay for, not just the 25 cents, maybe the 75 cents, maybe the $1.50. And again, yes, there was the Light Bulb Freedoms Act of 2009. Tea Party, Michelle Bachmann. Because, infringement on freedom. Washington is telling us which light bulbs we are not allowed to buy. Yeah, and it's good for us. There's a PhD economist in the employ of the Department of Energy figuring out which light bulbs are good for me. Thank you. And this person helps me save money. So, yeah, that's a ban, quite literally. By the way, 2016, Trump gets elected. He tries to withdraw that standard. He did. He did it ham-handedly, so it was struck down by the courts immediately. He would do it again. Well, 2016, he did it. Was there suddenly a flood of incandescents flooding the market? No, because nobody was producing them anymore. You can get, the artisanal light bulb, much like, you'll get the artisanal green hydrogen for your internal combustion engine in your $150,000 antique Porsche. Sure. The rest is electric. The rest is LEDs. And by the way, same story on EVs. 90% efficient electric vehicle, 40% efficient internal combustion engine. Doesn't matter what you put in, hydrogen or whatever else. So yeah, let's ban the stuff that doesn't work. That too is apparently George W. Bush 43. Bush the Younger. And you can go down this list. Now, it doesn't mean every one of these things needs to be banned. Of course not. It takes incentives. It takes nudges. By the way, pop quiz. First ever climate policy, ever, anywhere? King Edward I, 1306, England. His mom apparently had asthma because of all the outdoor air pollution. People burned coal. Ban on burning coal. Penalty for repeat offenders, death. That's a carbon tax. Okay, so there are problems. And by the way, we're still at this, right? So here's how science works. If you look at this November 23, so I'm not just showing you because it has my name attached to it, but it took us, 20 years, apparently, to start analyzing for something that makes it on the cover of Science. Full disclosure, not the penguins. That's what my 10-year-old thought when I told her I was on the cover of Science. It's the tiny little thing on top. But so it's sort of this question of, okay, if all this stuff is costless, if so much of it is costless, why isn't it happening? What are the true costs? Well, here's one. McKinsey told us in 2009. Same data. This is what consultants do, right? Same data set. They just spend many, many hours painting slides. Okay, cool. This is useful. The stuff that pays for itself. Well, getting rid of waste. Yeah, that's efficiency. That's productivity that pays for itself. Cool. Buildings. That's what our light bulbs are, by the way. Massive opportunity. Okay, why aren't we doing it? Because the upfront expenditure, the capital expenditure, the money it takes, at the $9 trillion, the 9 billion, the stuff that it takes to make this transition happen, yeah, that's costly. Well, sorry. It's kostet viel. This is opportunity. Okay, so here's the US response, which, by the way, was a complete surprise when it actually happened. End of July, climate policy was dead again for a generation. Early August 12th, 2022, the Inflation Reduction Act became law. Back then, the cost was $369 billion, estimated by the Congressional Budget Office. Goldman Sachs ran the numbers last fall. $1.2 trillion cost to the taxpayer. Why? Well, okay, here's the Wall Street Journal editorial. Because, overbearing Democrats and so on tricked us into this massive spending bill. It will, bankrupt us all, and so on and so forth. Why is it 1.2 trillion? Because it's open-ended tax credits. It's the sort of thing where, you put a finger in the air and said, okay, well, there's a tax credit now for lots of things, solar, air capture, green hydrogen, and so on, and we don't actually know the uptake, so let's make an educated guess. Let's, figure out the elasticities and run out second-order conditions and so on. Okay, cool. Well, we underestimated how popular these tax credits, subsidies, and so on are going to be. Cost to taxpayer, 1.2 trillion, according to Goldman Sachs. Investments overall, mostly private sector, of course, $3 trillion over 10 years. Actually, I should say not mostly, mostly private capital, exclusively private capital. 1.2 trillion in taxpayer, leveraging $3 trillion in private funds. The result, US GDP goes up, right? Sort of juiced up economy. Taxpayer, future taxpayers are spending for it, get to pay for it. Yeah, that's part of it. The other part, the positive kind of tipping point. The sort of version where, there is no going back. Once IKEA starts selling the induction plate for $60, we decarbonized our apartment 5 years ago, $4,000 induction stove. That same one, fairly fancy, $1,200 today. Used to be that the cheapest thing you could get in the student apartment with incandescent light bulbs was a $300 gas stove. Now it is a $60 induction stove that works as well as the technology used by the 3 Michelin star chef who no longer cooks with gas, but cooks with induction, more precise cooking, better technology. Property of a technology, it gets better and cheaper over time. That's a tipping point. And of course, heat pumps are part of this category. I talked about McKinsey slides. Here's a BCG one. Here's the impact, as estimated by BCG. Cost for solar PV, onshore wind, offshore wind. Yes, even nuclear too gets subsidized, is also part of the solution. Okay, so what does this all add up to? Okay, so here's my actual day job at Columbia Business School. Okay, so this is a picture of, anyone recognize this? First, Linz. Somewhat of a warning sign here, but I won't get into the details here. This is global steel, 10% of global emissions. And emissions are still going up. Why? Because we're still building blast furnaces in India, in China. The result? Massive pollution impact. By the way, 70% of it is precisely the coal-fired blast furnace. And the technology is 3,500 years old. Literally, the chemical equation, iron ore plus coal makes iron, and CO2 has been around for longer than the periodic table. It's not just the heat, it's the actual chemical process. These alternatives do exist. The thing we're building in Linz right now, yeah, that stuff exists and has existed, is used at scale, can't be used to make the original iron, can be used for recycled iron, using scrap metals. Okay, so what do we do? Well, yes, there are, as usual, every sector, there's like 15 technologies available that cut emissions 5%. And once you do, you're locked in. You can do your Brazilians are mixing biomass with the coal into the blast furnace. It makes the blast furnace 5% more efficient, decreases emissions 5%. Okay, well, if you build a coal plant right now, blast furnace, with mostly coal, a bit of biomass, you're going to be slightly better. You're not going to get to net zero with that technology. This is like buying a more efficient gas furnace right now, as opposed to going all the way to the heat pump. Right? There are 3 technologies that can do it. 2.5. CCS, carbon capture and storage, suck it back out. Yeah, works, supposedly. No full-scale plant. Why? Because coal plus CCS will always be more expensive than just coal. Not happening automatically. How do we do this? Well, there's this super innovative technology. Just use electricity and some chlorine, some other environmental impacts there. By the way, now you're building a solid-state battery, and you have other opportunities here. But that's sort of VC stage. This is where Bill Gates has $85 million of his money sitting at the VC stage, figuring out whether that can work. Here's what does work. In Europe, by the way, with $6.5 billion by now, the numbers here are slightly old, $6.5 billion, 6 billion euros in equity and debt investment. Who are the investors? Well, a bunch of rich Swedes, sure. Just Climate, Al Gore's climate fund, okay, yep, that too, of course. Who else is up there? Mercedes. Audi. Not listed here. One of the investors by now too. Why? It's this car company as the equity investor in the steel plant saying, yes, in order for us to get to net zero, we need the steel. There are perfect conditions up there. H2 Green Steel came first with this announcement. Literally, first. Using their technology, just doing it better, faster. Yeah, there's some other promises down the line. Sure. That was when they announced their plant. 2 years later. 40 million tons of, not zero carbon steel, but minus 97% carbon steel in Europe alone. By the way, some companies that are still building the blast furnace in India are now building the zero carbon, low carbon, minus 97% plant here. Conditions are perfect up in Sweden. Norwegian Statkraft is selling the cheap electricity with a long-term contract and so on, right? So happenstance in part. Where is the second plant being built? They tried in Spain. Lots of cheap solar, green hydrogen production right next to the solar plant and so on. They even had the press release already ready 2 years ago, Iberdrola and so on. Where is it actually happening? Thanks to Mercedes in the US. It takes the green steel, yes, that too. It takes the green growth mindset. It takes subsidies too, of course. It takes the broader conditions. It takes lots of things that fall into place. And yes, it takes cooperation. It also, frankly, takes competition. It's called co-opetition, if you will. Right? It takes cooperation to meet the climate goals. It takes maybe, well, this kind of competition among countries, among, yes, companies, of course, to actually do this transition. Nope, not everything will work out. Again, I won't say any more, I'll just show you the picture. Lots of things need to fall in place. But none of this is if. It is when, and up to a point, it is where. Let me just remind you that China, 4 5-year plans ago, didn't even mention climate in its 5-year plan. Then there came the intensity target. Then came the growth target for renewables. And now they have a zero carbon goal. They used to project to peak by mid-century, carbon emissions peaking by mid-century. The last announced goal was to have them peak by 2030. This year we know Chinese emissions are peaking next year in 2025. Thank you.